All right, hey, welcome back. We're about to get into our panel discussion. This, for underground sessions, is always my most favorite part of the night because everybody's a little bit off guard. They don't know what's coming. Again, there should be a slide behind me with a QR code. If you do have some skeptical questions you want to write in, we're going to prioritize those and try to get to as many of the other questions as we can in the next 50 minutes. So, we've been talking about a lot of stuff this weekend. Paul, Darrell, Teasi have just done a great job of getting us going, thinking about things. So now it's time to answer questions and model for people how they might respond. So I told them right away, we had a skeptical question that came in, and this, I will tell you, is a topic that I'm hearing more and more about, and it's the topic of hell. So the question is, how can a loving God send unbelievers to hell? Does God love people in hell? There's a lot of different threads going on about that now, so who wants to start? It's answering today's toughest questions, right?
C.S. Lewis said that the issue of hell is about people getting what they've chosen. That one of the strange things about our world is that God made a world in which we make choices because we're made in His image, and we are responsible for those choices. So when a person says, in effect, I'm going to do it my way and not God's way, you get what you choose. And I really think that hell, we learn about how hot hell is and how painful it is, etc. I actually think that at the core of the concept of hell is the idea of discovering that God does exist and you missed Him. Mm-hmm. So I tell people we all have moments in our lives where we do something and we wish, I wish I could unwind and undo that. And you kind of get that, you even think about it and you go, I really did that. Yeah, it was bad. Okay, all right. Imagine discovering that God exists and you missed Him. Mm. That's hell.
Mm-hmm. So the second part of that question was, does God still love the people in hell?
He respects the way that He made us enough to give us our choice.
All right, so Darrell, a related question to you. This was directed to you from Mark, because it's related to this. What do you believe is the absolute minimum a person must believe in order to be guaranteed of going to heaven? The minimum. The type of baptism. Speaking in tongues.
This is why you talked about which hill do you die on?
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
Because there's only one hill.
Yeah.
There's only one hill.
That's good.
It is the recognition before God that I am not who He made me to be, and that God in His mercy took care of that space through what He did through Jesus Christ, and that the calling that represents is that I am called to be connected to the God who made me. The Christian faith is ultimately about soul real estate. It's about location. It's about understanding that you were made to image God. So it means to be in God's image, is to image Him. And when we exclude Him, or when we turn our back on Him, or when we fight for our own control of our world, we are not imaging the way God made us. Mm-hmm. And yet God, in His mercy, sent someone to make that obvious to us. And when we recognize that and take up what He offers, He gives us what we don't deserve, which is why the term grace is so amazing.
All right, so there's a couple other tough questions here. I'm gonna go to one that's directed to Paul. This is a less tough question, but there's tougher follow-up ones. So
Start easy.
don't get too
warm
sick.
you up.
Okay, but I think this gets you into. So the question is, what question is the best way to start a spiritual conversation? And then I'll jump back to the tougher questions. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's two actually that, why do you think that, and what is it that you want? And I think those are two of the most underutilized questions in your arsenal of questions. The first one gets at the burden of proof is not on, the person making the assertion about things, you shift the burden of proof to them. Why do you think that? And I think that's a really helpful question to sort of help people see that maybe they haven't thought deeply enough about the issue. And the second question, I know you asked for one, but the second question, what is it that you want? It's interesting, that's actually the first thing that Jesus says to his would-be disciples in John chapter 1, verse 38. I think it's Andrew. And it's really the question underneath all of the questions, right? What is it that you want?
It's that James K.
Yeah,
Smith
that's right.
book too,
That's
right.
right.
Yeah.
And I think that's right.
You are what you love, right? All this-
And that gets at this idea that we long for a story that's both true to the way the world is. That's the why do you think that? But also true to the way the world ought to be, right? That we long for a world that satisfies all the deep longings of the heart. And as it turns out, Christianity is that story, is that world. So.
And can I make an observation about that first question? Yeah. Because in talking about listening, there are two ways that first question can be handled once you get an answer. You can handle it in terms of, now I'm going to set you straight on why you think this way it is. Or you can use it as a piece of information that says, this is how this person is putting the world together. And you might have a response in your head, but you may not initially decide to go there because you may want to find out more about why that person has answered that question the way that they have. Mm-hmm. That's what getting a spiritual GPS reading is, because what you're trying to do is you're really trying to nail down what makes this person tick and how do they prioritize what they are experiencing around them. And the better reading I have on how that works and what's going on, I'm put in a better position to know how to converse with them. Because in the end, there's not going to be a formula for these conversations. If you're a good listener, you're going to recognize there's not a formula to these conversations. There is a responsiveness to these conversations that they require.
I noticed there's a theme in the way you're answering questions this weekend, Darrell.
Yeah.
There'll be a test
You've been
later.
listening.
Yeah. I have been listening.
Yeah.
That's right. I've not just been asking questions.
I was just going to add, even backing it up a little further, like how to initiate a spiritual conversation. And once you've initiated and there's these questions we can continue to ask, but I just think some of the big worldview questions are great conversation starters with anyone. Just, hey, what do you think? And obviously a level of relationship is probably necessary to get into these kind of conversations, but where do you think everything started from? Why do you think we're here? Something that isn't like getting a Bible out and asking them, how do you interpret this verse? But just general big questions that we're all asking, just getting an opinion, starting with that, and then letting it go from there.
Okay. You're blown away by a sunrise.
Yeah. So can we take what we're talking about and apply it to a couple tough topics? So there are several questions here. I don't want to bundle them all together, but they're the big topics. So abortion, LGBT issues, abuse. So the one question was, why do Christians hate LGBTQ people? They were born that way, so why not love them? That's one question. How would you apply kind of what you're talking about to answering that question? Or maybe you go in a different direction. Well, and that's open for everybody. Yeah.
Yeah. I actually do believe that some people are born that way. There is scientific research that says you can ask certain people to respond in a certain way and change, and they don't change. And then when you say you should be able to change and they can't, you have really put them in an awkward position. So what do you do with that person? Now, there's a category that exists in the church that I say, when I talk about this subject, if anyone needs the support of the church, it's this group of people. And it's a person who is born sexually inclined toward the same sex, who at the same time, because of their commitment to Christ, says, I know that results in a decision I shouldn't make, and so I've chosen to live a celibate life as a result. Think about the position they're in. The gay community doesn't like them, okay, because they've said that choice is wrong. And the church sometimes doesn't like them because of what they recognize about themselves. If there is any group that needs the total support of community and love and support, which is oftentimes what people are looking for in these situations, it's that person.
I just had a thought. I agree, and that's so wonderful. I was having a thought, though, that we have to also look at the kind of the implicit assumption that being born that way equals being morally right or according to God's perfect will. Is being born that way our ultimate litmus test for how we should live? And so I don't know if that's making any sense.
That's a great observation.
It's like, okay, someone could be born that. I think a lot of times people use that as their out. Well, I was born this way, so that's my reason to just ride this lifestyle out.
Yeah, and
we're all born a way that is against God, and some, or leaning in a way toward a temptation or desire.
So let me use an analogy that I think will help us here, and it is I often say when I get into the LGBTQ discussion, I'll say, well, let me talk about another category that we respond to somewhat, in many cases, somewhat differently. Alcoholism. Okay? A person who says, I am an alcoholic, even if they've quit drinking, okay, knows if they take a drink, okay, they're in trouble. They're made that. We live in a fallen world, and we are all reflections of that fallenness in one way or another. Okay? It's God's commitment to try and restore that to some sense of wholeness. But full wholeness is not coming until down the road. And so yes, you don't want to use that as an excuse that you're right. Now, all these areas that we're going to get in are going to be needed to be calibrated. They're going to need balance. And the balance here is I need to recognize that some people are made. I also know that there are people who claim to be made that way who in fact are not made that way. Okay, so that's another part of the difficulty of this is that you don't know which group someone is in until some time has passed. And that's what makes this area so challenging for people because we want to make everybody all the same.
Right.
And they're not.
Great. Do you mind? Hey, great answers. Do you mind if I don't want that to be the only topic we talk about. So because there's a couple other hard ones here. So Teasi, this one was directed to you, but feel free to call in a lifeline here.
Okay. Thank you.
How can there be a loving God when I keep hearing about things like murder on a college campus and children being abused? A loving God would never allow that.
Okay.
So this is an important question, but it's obviously a very emotional question too.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think again, this is something that you obviously understand. Someone is dealing with a level of pain, and they're probably not looking for a logical answer to the question, but there is a logical answer, and there are biblical answers. And so it takes time and relationship to address these, but I think for me, and again, I am going to call on my lifelines after I share a few thoughts, but what I think of is that there are many aspects to God's love, and one of those beautiful aspects of his love is giving us free will, and also in his final dealing with horrible sin and evil, he has already dealt with sin and evil at the cross, and it will be dealt with once and for all. And so the problem of evil is actually not a problem overall. It's just we're still in the story. We're still working through part of that story where we're walking it out. So God's love is much bigger than just a world in which nothing bad happens, because the only way he could assure that that would be the case, an evil-free or a suffering-free world, would be to create human beings with no choice, because really the moral agents in those actions are humans, in murder and in, these horrific crimes. The agents that are committing the sin is not God. It's a human being. So that would be one aspect of it. What are you thinking? I can tell you've got that look.
No,
it's the European look.
This is well, it's true.
What
There's
is
so much
what is
more
that
to
look?
it.
That's the question.
I joked earlier about
There's
having
so
the
much to
European look.
this big question.
This is actually a question that philosophy's been dealing with for a long time. So
Let's go. We have a
I know.
philosopher on the panel right here.
I have thought about this, yes.
You want to jump in?
Sure, yeah. For years, I've taught on the problem of evil. This is the
Right.
question.
So it is under that
It's
big
under that
category,
umbrella,
right?
and there's this wonderful question that it really actually Barna did a survey of, like, if you could ask God any question, what would you ask God? And the number one question is, God, why do you allow pain and suffering? So this is a huge problem, and in fact, one writer called that question, the shape of a fishhook in the human heart, just sort of tugging at the heart. And so it is a question that we need to take seriously. For years, the answer that I would give to this, just sort of teaching on the topic, is a view called skeptical theism. I won't just do a lot here, but and it's not that we're skeptical that God exists, but it's theists, Christians, who are skeptical that we can know God's morally sufficient reason for why he allows certain evils, right? So the claim is that for every instance of pain and suffering, these are evils, God has a morally sufficient reason, but those reasons are just inscrutable to us, right? Think of like Romans 11, the doxology there. We just can't discern the reasons for God allowing these things. But we know because God is good that he does. So for years I've been kind of in what's called the skeptical theist camp in philosophy. Lately I've been shifting a little to the other tradition in the Christian history of thought is what's called a theodicy, giving a God-justifying reason for why he allows evil. And this is an attempt to say, here's the reason, and they'll give free will as a reason or things like that. I've become convinced, partly actually going through a period of pain in my own life and loss, and in the midst of that, reading the 600-page tome on suffering by Eleanor Stump called Wandering in Darkness. And in there, she named something that I missed in all the years of teaching on the problem of evil. Because she said, when you lose the deep desire of the heart, and I was going through a time where I lost a deep desire of the heart, she said that all of your other desires sort of fade away. And then she named it. She says, when you're heartbroken. And suddenly I'm like, oh, that's what this feels like, right? Because I was heartbroken. And then I started looking around at people in restaurants. I'm like, wait a minute, there's heartbreak. And there it is too. And it's over there. And so it gave me this whole new lens to view the problem. And what Stump is doing in that book, and she's just articulating, I think, a biblical view, she has a very high view of theodicy. The suffering and evil that God allows you to go through must benefit the sufferer. It's a person-centric, person standard. That's a really hard bar. But she says, and basically, long story short, the only way that you can get a God-justified reason to work is if you extend beyond this world to the afterlife. And as it turns out, the highest good for humans is to know God. And so the morally justified reason for why God allows pain and suffering is either to bring us closer to God or to ward us off or prevent us from going further away from God. And she has, so a longer story, but I'm becoming more and more convinced that there is some sort of a reason in that ballpark. But again, we're not going to always know everything.
Well, so I think there's a lot of questions in here that would fall underneath this camp. This happened in my family or whatever. Actually, my wife and I did a whole thing on this, so I feel like I was in line with what you said, so I feel good. But yeah. So can I just go with you for another second, because there was a question here. I wouldn't categorize this as the tough one, but coming in from the audience for the weekend, would you share practical ways we can be students of the culture? How can we engage the culture without being ensnared by it? And then, I'm sorry. That is part of the question, but the question I actually wanted to ask was this. What's the relationship between cultural apologetics and the culture wars? Do Christians focus too much on fighting the culture rather than building bridges? Can you speak to that, which I think kind of gets into that first one I mistakenly asked?
No, that's great. And I think that, Darrell, you mentioned a little bit about the cultural war mindset and that we need to move off of that, which I would totally agree. I think, so cultural apologetics is taking, or at least the way that I'm conceiving it, is how can we show those in culture, which is all of us, right, that Christianity is both true to the way the world is and true to the way the world ought to be, that it's both reasonable and desirable. And as it turns out, like traditionally in apologetics, we focus on the rational part, right? And rightly so, right? Coming from the modern era and Enlightenment, everybody was arguing about the irrationality of your faith, right? Hume famously said that the greatest miracle of all is that Christians actually believe this stuff, right? That's the only miracle that really happens. And from there, it just went downhill, because now you have the new atheists and people like Richard Dawkins that write books with titles like God Delusion or something like that. So rightly so, we ought to engage this charge that Christianity is irrational. And I'll just say, and I say this oftentimes talking to students, especially high school and younger, that there's nothing that you will hear in your English class, your physics class, or your biology class, or chemistry class, or anthropology class. There's nothing that Christianity can't handle, right? Mm-hmm. The evidence is widely available, I think, and that Christianity makes the most sense of that. I think I forgot my train of thought. And so we want to... So some people have objections about the reasonableness, but today in our culture, I think there's this other strain of objections that have to do with the desirability. And a lot of the questions about LGBTQ, abortion, abuse, and on and on and on, the hypocrisy of the church, are on this other set. And so my proposal is just to expand the objections and to realize that some people think that it's irrational, and they want it to be true, but they think it's irrational, and we need to have an apologetic for that. Mm-hmm. But other people don't want it to be true because they just think it's archaic or repressive or unloving. Mm-hmm. And I lay the fault for that, the fact that it looks unlovely and undesirable, often at the church's feet. Mm-hmm. And so there's a whole long story there. Mm-hmm.
So would you have to, if there's specific questions on those topics, like for example, somebody asked the question, this is an abortion question. Why do Christian men want to control women's bodies and prevent them from choosing what to do with their bodies? Does that need to be handled? Would that question need to be responded to in a different way, or would that fall underneath what you're saying? It
would fall under this. So I would lay the reason. Part of that question is that we have such a weak theology of the body and a weak theology of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman, and how those all work together and the beauty of life. That these kinds of questions even come up. If we as the church had a rich theology of life and family and all of these things, marriage, I think that the Christian option, the traditional views would look attractive. But they look so unattractive that we get questions. So I think we do start there. And then, of course, from there, we need to address the actual issues.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about that is I actually hear people say they would say Catholics are much stronger on the abortion issue than evangelicals, but they actually have written a lot more about the theology of the body, which evangelicals typically haven't. So.
That's right. Well, I'll just make one observation, and that is the reason the woman has a baby in her body is because of a man. Mm-hmm. Okay? So the idea that this is an isolated conversation that just involves, it is, in fact, part of the problem is it's because the man doesn't take responsibility in the individual relationship, oftentimes, that produces the tension of the woman feeling this is mine and my body, and it's all being left to me. That's one element. One other observation shows how tricky this area is. We're actually not talking about culture in the singular. Mm-hmm. We're talking about cultures. Pluralism is about cultures. So one of the things in writing the book Cultural Intelligence dawned on me, I'd written the entire manuscript. It was all done. And I had a missionary who worked around the world who was interacting with me on a guy named Bill Taylor, who was representative for the World Evangelical Association. And he wrote me and said, what do you do with the variety that is represented here? And the point that he was making was a great point is, pluralism is pluralism for a reason, okay? And someone asked me in the audience in the break, so what is pluralism anyway? And they're trying to, I just assumed it, which was a mistake. So pluralism is the plurality of all kinds of things that form not culture, but cultures. Culture is like plate tectonics. Cultures are rubbing against one another, building pressure on each other as they function. And in plate tectonics, if you get enough pressure, you know what happens. You get an earthquake. So we're really talking, and by the way, we are all infused with culture. There is no escape from culture shaping us. Okay?
Or us creating a culture.
Exactly. Well, everybody's creating culture of one sort or another. This church has a culture. Okay? The church across the street has another culture. This community has a culture. Texas has a culture that isn't New Jersey.
Oh, we know.
Okay. All right. And that's just one dimension of it. There are ideologies that form cultures. There are nationalities and their history that form cultures. Okay? This is oh, what a tangled web we weave. Okay? That's what we're talking about.
Okay. Before we leave, do you want to? Yes.
Just say something?
Yeah.
I guess my thoughts are all over the place, but I wanted to say one of the things that I mentioned in my talk last night, but also just think adds to the way to relate in cultural apologetics, adding this in, is thinking about the fact that we all have the same emotional needs for unconditional love, affirmation, purpose, and security. And everyone, I look out at the world and there's just a world of broken hearts, and we're all looking for that. And I think those are equalizers. I like to try to find the equalizers, what kind of makes us all in the same boat. And then, having conversations about how is what you're going to for that working for you. Because I truly believe that we have the real remedy. I really believe that Jesus, that our Creator understands how to meet all those needs the best. But I've tried a lot of the counterfeits. I've been there. And so I think having that compassion to walk through understanding that we're all trying to get those same needs met, but and this was horrible, but I was thinking of those survival shows where when people get so thirsty, they'll drink their own urine. That's gross, but anyway.
Thank you for that.
Yes. I hope that keeps you up at night. Anyway.
All right, moving on.
Anyway.
Darrell, there was a question for you, and this is actually just a logistical question. Is there a difference between evangelism and apologetics? How would you parse those out? Maybe actually any one of you can comment on that, but it was for you.
I think I'll use the picture of a Venn diagram. There's a little bit of a distinction between them, but the purpose of each is the same. And so, apologetics is coming at particular questions in particular ways because of issues that people are raising. Evangelism is a little more open-ended in terms of the way it can go at what it is that God is doing and saying. And oftentimes we need apologetics alongside our evangelism because the person that we're talking to is struggling with the theological construct that we are presenting in the gospel. This is actually one of the reasons why we have to be good listeners. Because when I take my agenda to someone who isn't a theist, okay, I'm asking them to leap tall theological buildings in a single bound, okay, and they are not Superman or Superwoman. So I've got to build bridges towards them in order to draw them into the core conversation. In fact, this is one of the challenges that we have in our time that did not, generally speaking, exist in the first century. In the first century, everyone believed there was a transcendent world. It was just a question of how crowded it was. Okay? There were lots of gods. Okay? Take your pick, and you had a God for virtually anything and everything. Okay? This is why some of the Christian approaches that rely either on Reformation figures or 19th century figures or even figures before that, or even talk in some cases about the biblical perspective, have to deal with the fact, the Bible's view on atheism is the fool who doesn't believe that there's a God, which isn't much of a bridge initially, okay? But it is an assessment of if there is a God and you think there isn't one, that is a bad mistake. So the challenge is how far some people, given where they are, need to come, even to begin to process what it is that we're saying to them or trying to say to them.
Yeah. Great. Teasi, a couple parenting questions. So there was one question for you My college-aged children are ashamed of the poor reputation Christians have in our culture as bigoted, hateful, intolerant, and judgmental, and they think this mutes their voice as Christians. What would you say to them?
Well, I would acknowledge that those things are actually true at times. Not trying to hide that or ignore that. Those are the realities. But and maybe even going into asking them how that experience is for them in their world and really entering into what is causing them to talk about that. But also just to remind them that Christianity isn't it's about Jesus, not his followers. His followers are not who we're following. We're following Jesus. And I liked what Johnny was saying earlier today. Was it today? My time frames are, but just that, we have this illusion that following Jesus is supposed to be easy and everyone's going to like us, but actually scripturally that isn't the case ever. Mm-hmm. And just so we're in good company, rise to that challenge, feel that passion. And I really loved that, what he shared about your passion being equal to the cost you're willing to pay for something. And I really loved that. I think that's important to instill in our teens again.
Good. Paul, for you, this question's from Stella. Paul, not you, like
the other Paul.
Right. The other guy. Addressed his audience in Athens with time to explore ideas. How do we tackle this nowadays with so many Athens bubbles? So she cites workplace, diverse ethnic or religious backgrounds, and our audiences are communicating through social media channels, which makes it more challenging. So I think the question is, how do you tackle the many different Athens bubbles that we encounter in daily life?
Yeah, I think, as Darrell has said a few times, that we learn to listen and we engage as people. We engage other people as people where they're at. And so, it just requires of us intentionality, and it requires of us, I think, walking in the power of the Holy Spirit, right? And this is one thing I love about, I'm always struck in Acts 3, where I think it's Peter and John are walking to the temple. There's someone begging, and they ask them for money. The beggar asks them for money. Peter stops. He doesn't give them money, but he heals them. And what was so interesting about that was that Peter very clearly was walking with this expectation that God was active in his life and that God was wanting to use him in other people's lives. And to me, that's maybe the posture I think that's key with this, because you're right. Mm-hmm. Culture is not monolithic. There's cultures. It's and it's not logical. Nothing's put together that way. And so it just requires discernment that God is at work in my life and that God wants to use me in the lives of others, and then go from there.
All right. So next question for you, Darrell. There's a couple questions in here, but they all relate. The question is the church beyond repair? Where then do Christians turn for solid discipleship? And related to that, we talked a little bit about even pastors not having a biblical worldview. This question was, what does that say about the effectiveness of seminary training?
Okay, well, I want to
not Dallas, though, not Dallas.
I want to build a fence and a sign around every church that says, your tax dollars at work. Because we're all under reconstruction, various points and ways. We're not perfect people. We will, in one sense, we will never be perfect people. And so failure is going to be a part of the experience of people in community. The question is not whether failure will come. The question is, how are you going to deal with the failure when it comes? Mm-hmm. And so that is the challenge. So yes, the church sometimes does fail to live up to what it is God asks of us, but that's because when God saved us, he didn't say, well, I'm done with that now, I can move on to the next person, okay? He's quite busy working in all of our lives. And with different levels of responsiveness from us as people. And so, yeah. Now, what about the effectiveness of seminary training? I'll say it this way. If we did not have seminary training, we might be in a worse place. Imagine that. Okay?
That's a good answer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, can I jump back to a couple of skeptical questions, which I think are somewhat related here. So the question, and I'll just throw this out to all of you. If God desires all people to be saved, would you explain and elaborate on John 12:40? He has blinded their eyes and he has hardened their hearts, so that they will not see with their eyes and understand with their heart and be converted, and so I will not heal them.
This is a variation of the predestination question to some degree. And I'm going to try this.
You going to lay down again?
No.
He's looking to a rafter to
No,
swing
yeah,
from.
But
He's going to climb on top of the
There
set.
may be people laying down when I'm done. Let me try it this way. This is a question that is beyond us. Here's what I mean. If you look at that graphic up there, okay, there's a light bulb and there is something behind it, okay? But the only reason I know that there's something behind it is because I live in a three-dimensional world and not the two-dimensional world of that graphic, okay? God lives as an omniscient being in a dimension separate from the way I relate to time and space. And because of that, there are relationships that are a part of who he is that are processed differently than the way they get described to us so that we can understand them. And so when I get asked this question about, there was no sequence in God, in one sense. Okay? It is who he, just think about this. This is a being who is so great and so different than us. That he has that characteristic. And so I say there are some things that we do not understand the sequence that is at the core of God's character, even though it gets described to us as a sequence.
Can I just add a little bit on that? Because I heard the question slightly differently,
Okay.
wondering if, so there is this distinction, or this question, what kind of knowledge does God want of us, right? How does God want us to know him? And I think that sometimes the assumption is that we just need to have what we would call in philosophy propositional knowledge. We know that God exists, we know that Jesus is God, and that's good enough, right? Mere a kind of thin theism where, we just believe that God exists or something like that. And of course, even in, the demons believe that God exists, as James 2 says. And so that's actually not what God is after. The kind of knowledge that God desires of us is richer. It's filial language. It's family language, right? That he wants us to know him as Father and as Abba and as Lord and Master. And so the idea is that the evidence is out there. Blaise Pascal has this wonderful phrase where he talks about the evidence for God is just hidden enough that those who don't want him won't see the evidence. But it's just obvious enough that those who seek him will find him, right? And I think the difference is that God just doesn't want us he doesn't want our minds, he wants all of us, right? He just doesn't want mere belief. And so I think that's part of it too, this question of, what is it that God actually wants? He wants all of us. He wants our hearts. He wants us to trust and know him as Abba.
So there was a follow-up question here about what does it actually mean to be a Christian, and are there certain doctrinal truths that must be accepted to be a Christian? Which is sort of a variation on the question for Darrell before. So maybe we've already answered it. Or would you add some nuances to that?
Just to say this much, that I would say Trinitarianism is very important to the essence of what makes Christianity distinct as a religion. And so not only do you have Jesus as the Word, but you also have this conception of the way in which God has how am I going to say this? Enmeshed his involvement with humanity, that he has given his Son to take on as well part of who we are as human beings. I mean, that is, Philippians 2 pictures it as the ultimate condescension. And we can actually apply it as an illustration of what we've been talking about all weekend, which is God was so concerned to establish contact with us, that he became one of us so that we could establish contact with him.
Good. Good. There's a couple of questions related to coming back to the gender issue. Some variations on essentially, so like for Teasi, although others can answer. One of our children who's a believer thinks it's disrespectful that we will not use they, them pronouns when referring to a friend, even in our own home when the person is not present. How would you respond to a Christian child about this? And there's a couple other variations on that topic, but
That
maybe
it's
we should come back to it.
disrespectful for the parent not to be using the
Not
pronoun?
to refer to the person as the pronouns they want to be identified as.
Okay,
So, this is a generalized question about how do we approach the pronoun conversation.
right. I know you've had many podcasts about this, and so I'm almost
This was for you.
curious to know what he said he has, 70 podcasts from every angle of these issues?
Yeah,
With
pronouns
many, many guests.
Yeah, pronouns are tricky. Yeah, they are. There's a part of me that says that part of building a bridge is trying to start with where that person is coming from and bringing them along. That would say to me, I'm not going to object to the use of pronouns that someone asked me to use to refer to them. But the problem is to leave it there. And so the next step in that conversation, assuming that you're building these relationships that we're talking about, et cetera, particularly with a child who's observing what you're doing in relationship to one of their friends, okay, is another conversation about what the choice of that pronoun might obscure.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're being kind and gracious and to some degree respectful in a relational kind of way by using those pronouns. But you've also got to point out the inadequacy of what that represents in terms of the reality of what's going on around.
Yeah, I was going to say that when I hear it, the counter argument is essentially, is it loving if you're not affirming what's real and what's
right,
true?
That's right. And so,
which is a very philosophical question, Paul.
Yeah.
It's,
Right.
Question.
Yeah, and so that's the challenge of it. The challenge of it is always, and frankly, the hard part here is that we have made, I'm going to say this because this is really important, I think. We have made homosexuality a special class of sin. Mm-hmm. That's not the way Romans 1 treats it. Romans 1 uses homosexuality as an illustration of where culture is. But then it supplies a vice list. Okay, you know about this in Greco-Roman ethics. A huge vice list that includes all kinds of things, like arguing with your parents. I'm actually glad that one's there. Okay. And a whole list of things. And I once had a high school pastor say to me, when I teach Romans 1, I have my kids put their initials by the thing that catches them out. Because Romans 1 is building to Romans 3, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And the end of Romans 1 says, people who teach these things. Now, I teach New Testament and grammar, and these things is plural, okay? We're not just talking about one thing in chapter 1. We're talking about the list. So any one of those things is a disqualifier. And so we have made this a special... So we treat this sin in a certain way, and then we treat a whole lot of other sins in a different way. That's a mess.
I just wanted to add one little bit to that. Just thinking about the relationship with a child, with my teenager, not even getting into some of the deeper issues here theologically or anything, but just relationshiping my children. I've always felt like I just wanted to live my Christian faith out loud, including teaching or letting my kids know when I don't have the answers or when I'm still struggling through something or I'm still trying to find a landing place. And so if my teenager was disappointed in my decision to maybe not use a pronoun, I would just advise and showing them, modeling humble, gentle conversation about tough topics, and even asking them, could you please have mercy on me and have tolerance for where I am in my journey? I was raised this way. This is what I believe at this point. I'm open. I love people. I want to engage in this conversation in a meaningful way with you. Would you give me that same grace? And just walking like that and having those kind of conversations, those have been the most fruitful times with my own children. I don't have all the answers, but I do know how to have a humble, gentle conversation with my own children and ask if they could give me the same mercy that they want me to give them. And that seems to help us navigate some of the difficult moments.
And you might be able, in the midst of that kind of a conversation, to say, here's another factor in this question that's being raised that is a part of the conversation, and then you do this. How would you put that all together?
And the last thing I would add to that is I've shifted the debate sometimes, or the discussion, just by pointing out that the argument isn't with me, but it's with Scripture. And it's I'm just trying to work through my understanding of Scripture. And that kind of shifts it away from the emotion and like, hey, can we look at this and figure this out together?
Yeah.
So, great.
It's been helpful.
Well, we're about coming to the end of our time. There's a bunch of other great questions on here, and I know you guys will probably be hanging around for a little bit so people can find you. But we're hoping these conversations continue beyond this weekend. So my last question would be, could you just share with the audience what are some tools, what would be some exhortations you'd give to folks to keep these conversations going and keep continuing to grow in these areas? Or if they're looking for answers, general resource questions.
I wonder if we'll repeat some of the same things here, but
when we go left to right, you get the first crack at it.
As I said earlier this morning at my talk, that we, as part of our apprenticeship unto Jesus, we need to view Jesus as someone who possesses intellectual virtue, and in light of that, we need to be people who follow in his footsteps, and we grow in our developments of intellectual and moral virtue. And so what that would mean is that we need to read, right? And we need to study, and we need to see that our faith is a knowledge-based faith. And so these kinds of questions that are all really good questions, the truth is there's answers out there, right? We might not be able to pull them quickly out of our minds, but the answers are there. And so start where you're at. It doesn't matter where you're at. Just start. Pick up a book, grab a friend, and have a discussion, and then it's a wild ride from there.
Yeah, and I would add to that there are so many resources out there. I do say, in general, golly, there hasn't been a single doubt, a single struggle that I've ever had, and that I know I will have, that brilliant minds haven't addressed, and that I haven't found a very emotionally and intellectually satisfying answer to, because I want to give Jesus the benefit of the doubt every time, because he's worth it. But I think the advice I would give from just my perspective, I consider myself more on the educated lay level. I'm not a professional scholar or theologian or anything like that. Well, we're all theologians and philosophers. I would just say, take it at your own pace, and remember to have your head and your heart engaged, because it can become a real trap of comparison. It can be overwhelming. Maybe I'm just me. Maybe it's just for me, but just enjoy it and know that this is a part of learning these things is loving Jesus with your mind, and it is a form of worship. So.
And then I think what I would say is, if you major in relating to the person, and you are willing at points to say, if they raise something, you know what, I actually don't know the answer to that question, but if you'll give me a little time, I promise I'll get back to you on what it is that you're raising. And interact in that kind of a open-ended way. One of the dangers of Christianity is that we do a good job with our content, but we sometimes don't do so well relationally. It isn't the propositions that you know that make the difference, although they certainly frame what you do. It's how you connect with people that matters, particularly when you're challenging them about the way they live. And so that relational base, we're all theologians, we're all philosophers. Here comes the new one. We're all pastors. be pastoral.
Thank you so much, everybody. Can we give them a round of applause? Answer the questions.